Usual setup. My name is Miriam Hadja Sharif. I'm a student assistant here at the Society, and I've been asked and given the honor to host this webinar by the director Charlotte. Due to my keen interest in Chinese politics and the fact that I visited Hong Kong last autumn during the protests. With me today, we have the honor of introducing Professor Steve Tsang, the director of SOAS China Institute in London. Professor Tsang is a leading scholar and expert in international relations, politics, security, and history of mainland China, Taiwan, and Hong Kong. On behalf of the Danish Foreign Policy Society, thank you very much for taking the time out of your busy schedule to join us today and lend us some of your expertise. Today, we will focus on the current situation in Hong Kong. While China has managed to steer away from the worst of COVID-19, they have also cemented their grip on Hong Kong. The third wave of pro-democracy protests was revived in the spring of 2019 and has been consistent all through the year until coronavirus hit East Asia. In April of this year, 15 pro-democracy activists were arrested by Hong Kong police. In May, a new national security legislation was introduced and approved by Chinese Parliament. This law will be able to ban any act or activity deemed dangerous to Chinese national security. The law is expected to take effect in September, while Beijing is still working out the specifics. So, in this event, we will explore what this new development means to the semi-autonomous state of Hong Kong, and how should the rest of the world react. And now we'll give the word to Professor Tsang for a presentation.
Well, thank you very much, Miriam. It's a pleasure to join you and your members via Zoom. What I propose to do in the next 20 minutes or less is to focus on three issues. One is, what has China done about Hong Kong? And the second one is why? And the third one is, what are the implications of the Chinese action? So what has the Chinese government done, or what is the Chinese government doing at the moment? The really big initiative is, of course, the decision that was passed at the National People's Congress last week for a state security law for Hong Kong to be passed by the National People's Congress Standing Committee to be applied in Hong Kong. Now, it's a bit cumbersome way of putting it, because the National People's Congress did not actually pass a law, not yet. It simply made a decision and say that such a law is to be passed. And the law will be passed by the National People's Congress Standing Committee, which can happen this month or next month, or it can be dragged out for quite a bit longer. Normally, they would take several months make a clear decisions they want to get this done, and they are likely to, in fact, push quite hard on that. Now, why is this particular legislation important? And I think I use the term quite carefully. I describe it as the state security law. In most media, you will have read it as a national security law. It's an important, though subtle distinction. When we talk about, in English, national security, we know exactly what we mean. It normally means things about your national security, defense related, perhaps including issues like your national sovereignty and territorial integrity. Now, those are included in the law to be introduced to Hong Kong as well. But there is something more to it. The really big thing about this law is about subversion of state power. And what does subversion of state power mean in the Chinese context? It means subverting or attempting to subvert the monopoly of power by the Communist Party of China anywhere in the PRC, including Hong Kong. And in fact, this law will apply in particular to Hong Kong. rather than for the rest of the PRC. And that is where people in Hong Kong have a huge issue about it. It's not so much about secession, which is to be outlawed, but then people in Hong Kong have always known that secession independence was not really an option. And indeed, there was no call for independence, say 10 years ago. It really only started after Xi Jinping became leader in China in 2012 and adopted a much more repressive approach towards Hong Kong. The most important element, therefore, is about subverting state power, challenging the monopoly of power by the Communist Party in Hong Kong. This is what people in Hong Kong see as the most important issue. This is what they see as a threat to their personal freedom and integrity of the one country, two system model. So what people in Hong Kong have a problem with are the two elements to it. One is what are provided for in the new law. The second is the process of how it is being done. However controversial and objectionable the substance of the law may be, passing of a state security law in Hong Kong is entirely lawful, because that is provided for in the Hong Kong Basic Law under Article 23. And the Chinese government had tried to get that passed in Hong Kong through the normal procedures via the Hong Kong Legislative Council in 2003 and failed. On this occasion, they decided that they cannot get it done through the normal process. Therefore, they decided to have the National People's Congress to impose it. Now, that process of having the NPC legislating on behalf of Hong Kong, bypassing Hong Kong's own institutions or legislature, means that the whole political model in Hong Kong, the one country, two systems model, where Hong Kong is meant to enjoy a high degree of autonomy, is being bypassed. This is the biggest single issue for what is being done. Now, why is the Chinese government doing that? Why would it do something quite so dramatic? Because this is likely, and indeed is being seen by many in Hong Kong, as the beginning of the end of the one country, two systems model. And again, I say it's the beginning of the end, not quite the end, because the law hasn't been passed yet. At the moment, it's simply a decision that it needs to be introduced and enforced. So until that moment's come, it isn't quite the end. Now, why did it happen? It happens because you will remember that in most of the second half of 2019, last year, Hong Kong was in quite a spot of trouble, enormous amount of demonstrations and protests. Some of the protests turned violent because the Chinese government wanted Hong Kong to pass an extradition bill, which people in Hong Kong found very threatening to civil liberty, and therefore tried to protest to stop it, and indeed managed to stop it. That caught the Chinese government by surprise. They were not expecting that. They did not provoke intentionally the protest movements in Hong Kong. But they did see the protest movement as a direct challenge to the authority of the Communist Party, and in particular that of Xi Jinping, and that's not acceptable. And the policy, of course, came from Xi Jinping himself. And having seen the Hong Kong people behaving that way in challenging the authority of the party and Xi Jinping, it was decided late last year that they will have to do something to make sure the same thing cannot happen in Hong Kong again. And in order to do so, they make very important personnel changes at the beginning of this year, which essentially indicated they were going to adopt a very hard line on Hong Kong in order to drive through the Article 23 or state security legislation process. It happened in January when the director of the Central Liaison Office of the Chinese government in Hong Kong was being replaced. The title of the job does not give full recognition to how important it is. The director of the Central Liaison Office in Hong Kong is a full ministerial rank position in the Chinese system. It's a very senior official. The new man being appointed, Lo Wei-ning, does not have any prior experience of Hong Kong or knowledge of Hong Kong, or for that matter, foreign policy. He was not picked because of his ability to deal with the situations in Hong Kong. His record was being a very effective enforcer of Xi Jinping's policy as a provincial party secretary. And that was January, before COVID-19 came up on the horizon in a big way, even though it was in China, but it wasn't being recognized as a big issue when Lo Wei-ning's appointment was announced. Then in February, when China was in the midst of the pandemic crisis, when the party secretary in Wuhan and in Hubei province were being replaced, Xi Jinping also replaced the head of the Hong Kong and Macau Affair Office in Beijing. That is another ministerial rank position in the chain of command dealing with Hong Kong policy. The new man, Sha Baolong, share very similar background to the man appointed to Hong Kong. Again, his background is that of an effective enforcer of Xi Jinping's policy as a provincial party secretary level cadre. By that point, it was already clear to me that sometime in 2020, unless COVID-19 is going to devastate the Chinese economy so much that the Chinese government completely lost capacity to deal with anything else, they would push through a national security law in Hong Kong. What I did not expect them to do was to bypass the Hong Kong Legislative Council and openly demonstrating that no longer being respected in pretense. Now, why would they do that? Well, when they finally decided to push through this at the National People's Congress in May last month, it was perfect time. The countries that normally would speak up for Hong Kong are the countries from the Five Eyes: UK, US, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and members of the EU, particularly the western parts of the EU. And these countries are mostly on their knees because of COVID-19 and dependent on China for PPEs. What better time? What better timing is there for Beijing to push something like this in Hong Kong than now? That explains why the timing of it. But this did not happen simply because of COVID-19. It would have happened even without COVID-19. COVID-19 just make it so much better timing for them to get this done, to quote from Boris. Now, what does it mean? Well, what it means is that people in Hong Kong will try to resist. I think we're already seeing some protests happening, and people are being intimidated. The passing of the law is meant to intimidate people in Hong Kong so that they are so scared they would not go out to protest and demonstrate. We have seen some of them. It remains to be seen how big the scales will be. I would be surprised if there will not be a much more sustained efforts of protests further down in the year, unless all your activists are being arrested. We are also seeing a relatively robust response from the international community. For the first time, and it's not usual that one can say that the Trump administration in the United States does the right thing. For the first time, one can say that yes, they are doing the right thing in accordance with two US laws, the Hong Kong Policy Act of 1992 and the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act of 2019. And both acts together require the US government to certify if Hong Kong still enjoys the one country, two systems model with a high degree of autonomy. With the prospect of the state security law being introduced, it's reasonable for the US government to say that if and when that happens, then Hong Kong will no longer qualify under these acts to enjoy special status under US law. Now, they have not said what they will actually do yet. They simply say that there will be consequences. And likewise, we have seen the response from the United Kingdom, including from Boris Johnson, again going further than the British government has ever done since 1997 in offering people in Hong Kong who hold British national overseas passports the right to enter the UK and work in the UK for 12 months without restrictions or applications. And if they continue to do so, with a pathway to citizenship. Now, all these are in fact fairly modest at this stage. They are more barks than bites, because neither government in the, Washington or in London have specified what will actually be done about it. They simply say that we will take drastic actions which the Chinese government would not like. The intention clearly is to persuade the Chinese government to back off rather than continues to run through it. Will it work? That, of course, is the $6 billion question. It should. It should, because there's really no need for through the national or the state security law. And if they really have to, they have the option of getting the Hong Kong legislative councils to do it. There's no immediate hurry, or they can slow down the process and just see how things go. But they won't. They won't, because Xi Jinping is not for turning. The Communist Party, and particularly the Xi Jinping leadership, suffered a significant credibility problem back in the end of January and the earlier part of February, when COVID-19 was laying China low, and people were very, very angry with the mismanagement by the government, to the extent that they were talking about, would this be China's Chernobyl moment, whether the credibility of the Communist Party leadership could still hold. As a strongman in a Leninist political system, Xi Jinping has to show that he is strong and he will be able to do whatever it takes, and certainly not being bullied by some pesky, bloody foreigners. So the idea that UK, US, Canada, Australia, and others, by applying pressure on China, will get the Chinese governments to back off on Hong Kong is, I think, optimistic, to say the least. It is extremely unlikely that this will happen. So when, I think we are no longer talking about if, but simply when the state security law is fully enacted and implemented in Hong Kong, we will be seeing the beginning of the end of the one country, two systems model. There will not be a universally negative response for the simple reason that the business community cannot afford to do so. They do so, Hong Kong's economy will collapse, the businesses will collapse. Therefore, whether you're talking about local Hong Kong businesses or major multinationals, they simply cannot afford to do so. And they will therefore continue to articulate confidence in Hong Kong, hoping that the maintenance of judicial independence will enable them to keep Hong Kong going, which is also a very positive thing for Hong Kong. So even with the end of the one country, two systems, I would not say it is the end of Hong Kong yet. Not yet. We are not quite there, but it is certainly going to be the end of an era. I'll stop here and hand it back to you, Miriam.
All right, thank you so much for that presentation. That was very informative. And you sort of already answered my first question, which was about the timing of this. I will try not to say national security bill, but state security law. I understand there's quite a difference, but I would still like to talk about sort of the inner circles of Xi Jinping and also Carrie Lam, because I've heard you speak before that the days of Carrie Lam are pretty much over. It's only a matter of time before she will be removed from office. I want to know, do you still think that? And what are sort of the internal dynamics that are driving the Communist Party even through COVID-19?
Well, Carrie Lam's probably just got an extension of her political life for a bit, because the Chinese government had decided to go on the offensive even more than just try to contain the situation. So Carrie Lam also is a full ministerial rank official in the Chinese system. So you have three of them, the head of the Central Liaison Office, Hong Kong Macau Affair Office, and Carrie Lam in the Special Administrative Regions government. And Xi Jinping could replace both parties earlier this year, because that would have to be a meeting that he make a mistake. And he couldn't admit that he made a mistake with Carrie Lam. It was a lot easier to simply replace internal party people. And if he also replaced Carrie Lam before he tried to push through the state security law, it becomes very messy in Hong Kong, which is why I think Carrie just earned herself a bit of an extension of her terms of office. Where we have a problem with the policy-making process is that you have three full ministerial rank cadres. None of them will now say anything to Xi Jinping that contradicts what Xi Jinping wants to be done in Hong Kong. Carrie knows she is being kept because otherwise it would be too much of an embarrassment. So she has very little credibility in the system. Low in Hong Kong and Shah in Beijing have been appointed to be enforcers, with their predecessors being demoted. So amongst the career Hong Kong watchers in the Chinese bureaucracy who work for their predecessors, they all knew what happens to their boss. So who are they going to, in the current situations, to speak to their new bosses and say, "Sir, I think your policy is just about going to backfire, and it's going to provoke far greater resistance in Hong Kong. So that's not going to happen." So in terms of that policy-making process, we are not going to see much of input from people who understand the Hong Kong situation or the wider foreign policy implications, advising Xi Jinping to go slow. And of course, in terms of the foreign policy, we have also seen a turn towards a much more aggressive foreign policy as a result of COVID-19. So it becomes even more difficult for your career diplomats in the Chinese Foreign Ministry to come up and try to advise that maybe we shouldn't really go that far. We don't have to turn back. We just need to go slow. If we do not, now that we have decided we are going to have a state security law in Hong Kong, we can hold off for 6 months. There's nothing to stop us not passing the law for 6 months. But who is going to do it? Who is going to say it to Xi Jinping? I have doubts on that. Over to you.
Well, that's very interesting, because with the more aggressive foreign policy, I'm wondering what can stop Xi Jinping? What are his weak points if nobody wants to mention them to him? Is this serious enough to leave him with will he have less influence going forward?
Well, people like to say that in democratic politics, we think about today and tomorrow. In China, they think about 5,000 years of history.
Yeah.
Regrettably, that's simply not true. Politics in China is as short-term as politics in democratic countries. The difference is that we're being governed by the electoral cycle. They are being governed by the cycle of rotation of office. So they're also fairly short-term in terms of the view. In the long term, all the problems that Xi Jinping's policy will create are not problems for the people at the implementation level, even if they stay in the post, because if they now come out and advise against Xi Jinping, they get the job. They are disloyal. They are subversing the leadership. Whereas if they just go along with it, and since Xi Jinping can never be wrong, they following Xi Jinping's policy can never be wrong. So in career terms, they are safe. It will backfire, I think now matters a lot less than previously.
So I want to talk a bit about the inner workings of Hong Kong. I was wondering if you can give some context in terms of what role does basic law, the Constitution of Hong Kong, really play anymore? I mean, you mentioned it yourself that in 2003, a similar bill was proposed but later withdrawn. I'm wondering, what is the future of basic law in Hong Kong?
Well, ever since 1997, there was a small-scale, slow erosion of the one country, two systems model protected by the basic law in Hong Kong. That erosion was known to people in Hong Kong, but they all have a vested interest to pretend that it wasn't happening, because openly acknowledging that the basic law is being eroded or breached will hasten the end of the one country, two systems model. So as long as you could pretend in a credible way that the erosion is within acceptable limit, you would do so. It's in your interest to do so. The problem this time is that Beijing decided not to ram through an Article 23 state security legislation and simply bypass the whole establishment in Hong Kong to introduce this law blatantly violating the terms of the basic law. So it's very difficult for people in Hong Kong to pretend that the basic law is still being kind of, in general terms, just about upheld. They will still try to pretend that, but it will become a lot less credible, and people will know. And so you're going to see some Hong Kong business people trying to take some of their wealth out of Hong Kong if they can. You will have some people looking to leave Hong Kong, which is exactly why the British government came up with the arrangement for the BNO passport holders in Hong Kong. That's meant to reassure people that, in fact, you don't have to run. You can leave, and we will have your back, and we will have you if you need to leave. Now, whether that will work or not, again, remains to be seen. There is a technicality that the Chinese introduced laws in Hong Kong, which means that if you were born in Hong Kong, therefore, under Chinese law, post-1997, a Chinese citizen, you are not able to simply have British nationality being given to you without residence in the UK. If you get a foreign passport, you will need to formally renounce your Hong Kong citizenship, which is subjected to the approval of the authorities in Hong Kong, or in fact the Chinese government, before you can do so. So technically, even if the British live up to all its promised made by Boris Johnson, it doesn't mean that people in Hong Kong will be able to leave if the Chinese government doesn't want them to leave. Now, in reality, I don't think the Chinese government will hold them back, because the people who want to leave are the people who will be seen by the Communist Party as disloyal and potential troublemakers. And they'll probably just be happy to get rid of them and replace them by new immigrants from the mainland of China, whom they believe will be able to make Hong Kong even better. Over to you.
Yeah, that was actually very interesting. I had a sort of similar question because I'm very curious about the young population in Hong Kong. So let's say that this idea proposed by Boris Johnson and Dominic Raab gets enforced. A lot of the young people protesting now are born after the handover, after 1997. I imagine that the people who want to go to the UK have have the resources and means to get there, to get some residency, to build a life there, and then therefore get citizenship. But what about the young people? Will we see immigration issues from waves from Hong Kong, from the younger segment of the population?
Okay, if we ever get into that situation, we are dealing with what perhaps one could call an McCadden scenario.
Okay.
That things are getting very badly wronged in Hong Kong. If we are seeing things getting suddenly very ugly and very badly wronged in Hong Kong, and you have some Hong Kong citizens with BNO passports arriving at Heathrow Airport in London, it will become politically very, very difficult for the government of the day in London to turn them away, whatever they are. Whether they have means or whether they don't have means, it will be politically very, very difficult. So I think that's in some ways an academic point. But if we are not in that kind of scenario and people are simply leaving Hong Kong in advance of a crisis, then you are talking about mostly people who either have the means or the capacities to get jobs in the UK, who will be able to stay in the UK. Being given permissions to land and live and work in the UK for 12 months is a limited concession. In the longer term, you have to be able to prove that you are not a charge on British taxpayer for you to be given pathways to citizenship. That's sort of normal practice in the UK. So before a crisis, you will have to be able to prove that you will be able to get a job.
Yeah, okay. I would like to ask you sort of a particular question that might be hard to answer, but I'm going to try anyways. I was wondering if you think that there's some sort of blind angle in the way that we in the Western world view, talk, and analyze China and their decisions. I mean, you came up, you gave an example before about the difference between state security law and national security law and how we sort of define those terms. But do you see sort of blind spots that we often miss here in the Western world?
Where we often get it wrong about China is that in the post-Cold War world, we have forgotten that some states in the world are still very hardcore Leninist political systems. And the most important of which is China. I'm not advocating and I'm not in favor of a new Cold War or a return to any form of the old Cold War. But in the Cold War period, there was a recognition of the nature of those Leninist regimes. And we therefore devised policies that were realistic in dealing with those political systems. We have not done so since the end of the Cold War because, well, we thought we have won the Cold War. There isn't a problem with old communism any longer when the Chinese system remained fundamentally unchanged. Now, if we fully recognize that, we will be able to engage China in a much more realistic way. And we will be able to understand where the Chinese government comes from much more effectively. And if we can do so, we'll come up with policies that are more realistic and potentially more workable. Over to you.
Very informative. I'm going to remember. Before I hand it over before I ask the questions from the audience, I just have one last. What can we do here in the EU that will actually have an effect on China? Do we have any diplomatic response that could lead somewhere, or are we sort of trapped between the US and China?
If the EU is really minded to help, please overlook what Boris and remember what the EU really is about. And also remember that the EU is the largest, most important trading partner of China collectively. So collectively, the EU has enormous potential to put pressure on the Chinese government because being the biggest trading partner, any change in the economic trading relationship will have significant implications. I'm not advocating anything like the Trump type of trade war with the Chinese. That's not very helpful. But that leverage can be applied. But it will require the EU to act collectively as one on its common foreign and security policy, which historically has been more like rhetoric than real. If it becomes real, coordinated with policies in London and preferably with Washington as well, and the other Five Eyes countries, I think we will have an enormous amount of pressure that the Chinese government may not be able to resist.
All right, thank you. Now I will ask some questions from our audience. We have the first one from Flemming Utzen, who's a journalist at one of the biggest newspapers, Politiken. He says, hello and many thanks. Question, what does it tell the world about Hong Kong democracy movement that its most prominent icon, Joshua Wong, openly advocates for outside interference in Hong Kong's internal affairs? And he's referring to Wong's book on free speech.
Well, Joshua Wong been pushed and pushed, that they have done what they can, and therefore they are now trying to get what others can do to help them with. Now, I think it is not very wise for Joshua or his comrades to be appealing for external help. They should be focusing much more on their internal efforts to present the views of people of Hong Kong and explain why they are doing so. The outside world will respond in the way that they do. I don't think the fact that people like Joshua Wong are asking for foreign help will materially increase the level of assistance or not from Europe and America. And it will give the Chinese government the kind of basis that it was looking for to justify the introduction of the state security law. Because one of the things the state security law is going to do is to prohibit, outlaw, criminalize foreign interference. So asking for it really is falling into the trap of the Chinese government.
Okay, thank you. Now we have a question from Charlotte. She says, thank you, Professor Tsang. Is there support for Xi Jinping's policy in Chinese Communist Party? And she also asks, what about the role of Hong Kong in the economy of China?
Well, Xi Jinping does enjoy fairly general support within the Communist Party for the simple reason that if you are in the Communist Party and you do not support Xi Jinping, you will be investigated by the anti-corruption people and they will bring you down. So you have no choice. You will have to support Xi Jinping's policy at the risk of your own career and personal safety and perhaps even that of your family. It doesn't mean that there are no dissenting voices within the Communist Party. We know that there are dissenting voices within the Communist Party. There are sensible people who understand what are at stake, and they would have preferred a different approach. But those voices are not being fed effectively into the policy-making process at the top level, so that in terms of the economy, ways of looking at it, look at it on the quantitative, is that back in the 1980s, Hong Kong would account for something like about a third of China's economy. 1997, when Hong Kong was handed back to China, it was about 20%. By 2019, it's about 3% or just below. So if the Chinese economy were to lose Hong Kong completely, it will lose 3% of its economy. And the Chinese government knows that. In the course of the last quarter, because of COVID-19, the Chinese economy already lost 3%. Heaven hasn't collapsed. The Chinese economy remains relatively stronger than many Western economies. So if the worst were to come to fruition over Hong Kong, 3% loss of economy is sustainable loss. So on a purely quantitative level, I don't think the potential economic consequences on Hong Kong will be sufficient to deter the Chinese government from doing what they are doing in Hong Kong. And that is the main basis that they are calculating. Now, there's the other side of it, the qualitative side of it. Hong Kong can deliver to China a lot of things that cities like Shenzhen or Shanghai cannot. Hong Kong can get access, Hong Kong can inspire confidence that Shenzhen and Shanghai simply cannot do with the global business community and investors, and for access to intellectual property rights. But how much is that being taken into account? I think not enough. For a long time, the biggest protector of Hong Kong's status quo were in fact families of the top leadership in China who all have major investments in Hong Kong. But with the anti-corruption campaign in China, it becomes much more difficult for the wealthy families of the top leaders to be very effective in lobbying the top leadership, because the harder you do that lobbying, the more you are drawing attention to how much economic interest your family seems to be having in Hong Kong. And by the way, where do you get that wealth from? We all know how much everybody else are being paid. So we got a bit of a problem there.
And now there's a question from Jan Flimmer. He says, thank you for a fine presentation. Can I ask about a type of same issue? How do you view the relations between People's Republic of China, PRC, Red China, and Republic of China, ROC Taiwan?
What's the difference between the Chinese government and Taiwan towards Hong Kong?
No, I think, how do you view the relations between PRC and ROC?
Okay.
Yeah.
The escalation of tension between Taiwan and the mainland of China is largely driven by the Chinese Communist Party. The government in Taiwan hasn't changed because Tsai Ing-wen had won a second term. She still holds to the positions that she is willing and happy to work with the mainland side, as long as China is not imposing unreasonable conditions on that relationship. She is slightly less open than at the beginning of her first term in the language she used in her second inauguration, but she has not turned against that cooperation. She's kept the door open. Now, the Chinese government has actually taken a deliberately more provocative stance. We are seeing more units to circumnavigate in a intimidating kind of way. We are seeing senior Chinese leaders using language that include dropping the word peaceful in front of reunification, implying that China is now prepared to force Taiwan into a kind of unification with China, peaceful or not. We have also seen the Chinese government taking a more robust stance on Taiwan because of the embarrassment of COVID-19. The fact that Taiwan is the one country that has done best, most responsibly and effectively in coping with COVID-19 without infringing on civil liberties and civil rights. And it's being recognized by many countries internationally for this achievement, is extremely irritating to the leadership in Beijing, because it contrasts with the initial failures and, to some people, irresponsible management of the COVID-19 crisis when it started. And therefore, they have even more reasons to take a harder stance against Taiwan, for Taiwan doing all the wrong things from their perspective.
Okay, then we have a question from Finn Bo Jansen. He asks, if no, sorry, we have one before. I'm sorry, from Berit Trapp-Vincent, who asks, do you see a scenario where China takes over all businesses in Hong Kong, nationalize them, if you will?
No, I don't think we're going to see China fully nationalizing everything in Hong Kong. Well, even in China, it's a mixed economy now. Xi Jinping is putting a lot more emphasis on the state-owned sector, but he has not gone to the extent of wanting to fully nationalize the economy on the mainland of China. There's no reason to expect that he would do so in Hong Kong.
Then the question from Finn Bo Jansen. He says, if protests in Hong Kong are scaled down and stay peaceful, maybe Xi Jinping will not implement the new laws, or what? Is there a middle ground to be found?
Regrettably, no. That's not the kind of leadership that Xi Jinping is. That's a kind of scenario which just might potentially be possible if you have somebody like Hu Jintao as leader in Beijing. But even that is very optimistic. For somebody like Xi Jinping, who is vengeful, who is in many ways very small-minded, and never allowed any offense to go unpunished. The fact that he would have seen an open rebellion in Hong Kong in the second half of 2019 would have means that he would want to make sure that something like that simply cannot happen. Not just that it will not happen today and tomorrow, but that it cannot happen. And the only way that it cannot happen is for the state security law to be put in place and for the resistance to be crushed or force them out. If they all run away, disappear from Hong Kong, that's probably okay from Xi Jinping's perspective. But if they remained, then they must swear allegiance to the Communist Party rule, which implies swearing allegiance to Xi Jinping. I don't see all your Hong Kong protesters, the like of Joshua Wong or Edward Leung, doing so.
We have time for one final question from Charlotte.
Okay.
She says, if we fail to react with regard to state security law in relation to Hong Kong, what can then the consequences be for Taiwan?
I think it's easy to say that if we don't stand up for Hong Kong, get into a situation that the Chinese just get whatever they want to do, then the Chinese government will just do whatever they want to do with Taiwan. There is a small element of that, but I don't think that is a very big element to it. The Chinese policy towards Taiwan, I think, has already been set. They will do whatever it takes to get Taiwan into the fold of the PRC, and Xi Jinping intends to get this done before the end of his term as leader of China. The only saving grace is that Xi Jinping has abolished term of his leadership. Therefore, he is effectively leader for life. And as about 66, 67, he can easily last another 20 years. Therefore, he still have a lot of time to play with before he has to force his hands on Taiwan. But at that point, if Taiwan is still refused to submit to Chinese sovereignty, I believe that Xi Jinping will use force, and he is building up the military capabilities to do so. And whatever happens in Hong Kong, he will do that to Taiwan when the People's Liberation Army have sufficient naval and air capability to take Taiwan and deter the Americans from interfering. Taiwan, in geographical terms, now falls within China's first main maritime defense line, the so-called First Island Chain. And in fact, Taiwan is the single most important part of the First Island Chain. So from the Chinese contemporary maritime defense strategy, they need to have Taiwan as part of China's maritime defense parameter. And therefore, they will do whatever they can to get it when that moment comes, when they can do so.
So I want to say thank you to all the members who attended, and a special thanks to you, Professor Tsang. It was a pleasure spending the last hour with you and very informative. And I wish everybody a very nice day, and thank you for tuning in.
All right. Thank you very much, Miriam.
You are so welcome.
With pleasure.